Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to Malorie's Weird World Adventures, the podcast. I'm your host, Malorie.
And I'm your host, Michael.
And we're here to show you just how weird this world of ours really is. We are sitting here by the fire at the Hawthorne Hotel. We had a nice dinner, and we were talking with Mike about the history of Salem and the footprint left behind from the witch trials, and how that's kind of manifested into this very inclusive community today. So, Mike, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for coming to Salem. I love it when people come out here. My name is Mike, Dr. Vitka. If you might recognize me from Spellbound Tours. Also, I do Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore, weird history videos. I do the Salem Witch Trials and Paranormal Investigation. And that's what we're all about. This is the original Salem Ghost Tour. 25 years as of 2025.
Wow, that's amazing. That's quite a long run. Congratulations. So can you tell us, I guess, a little bit about, just briefly, the history of the witch trials for people that don't know anything about it at all?
Sure. Where do you want to start?
Start from the beginning.
Oh, wow. There have been books, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages written about the witch trials. Mm-hmm. So let me try to give you the condensed version of it. First of all, there were no witches in Salem. We'll cross that misconception out. At the time, in 1692, not a single person who was accused of witchcraft was a witch, at least not by our standards. So nowadays, Salem is a community filled with witches, but in 1692, there were very strict Christians, miserable Christians, called the Puritans. Mm-hmm. Now, the Puritans were so strict that they were even killing Quakers. That's how uptight they were. Mm-hmm. The Puritans hated everybody. And that started out in England, and they moved here to the New World. They wanted to build a community for themselves. They wanted to build a place where they were free to be terrible. Their theology, they believed in predestination, but they didn't know who was predestined to go to heaven, but they knew that if they screwed up, they were going to go to hell. So you had to live your whole life not knowing if you were saved, but still having to adhere to Puritan godliness, or else you were damned. Mm-hmm. That was sort of their mindset. They hated anything that was even a little bit different, and they started forming a community in Salem, basically like a religious regime. Mm-hmm. And it was with the Puritans this whole thing started. There's a guy named Reverend Paris, and he was the minister in Salem. He wasn't a very good minister. He was a failed trust fund idiot who thought he could make money as a minister. And for years, Salem had trouble holding on to a minister just because of how contentious and miserable the Salemites were at the time. And the ministers were fired. They were quitting left and right. And Reverend Paris thought he could slip in and fill that role. He negotiated forever about minute things like how much his salary was going to be, how much firewood he was going to get. Like if you look at Reverend Paris, the minister's writings, it's more about how much money he was going to get paid than any religious stuff. Mm-hmm. And so he ended up in Salem. He was the minister. He promised he was able to get more attendance into the church, and he did not do a very good job of that. And people immediately didn't really like Reverend Paris. Mm-hmm. And it was in his household that the witch trials, the whole witch hysteria started to blossom from. Mm-hmm. Like when he had come over here, he'd brought his family, and he'd brought a woman named Tituba. Tituba was enslaved, and Tituba was supposed to look after his kids. And the kids started hanging out with Tituba, and they started interacting with her. They started listening to her tell fanciful stories, folklore from her own culture. Mm-hmm. And of course, when they got caught, they freaked out and panicked. Mm-hmm. And nobody could figure out why these girls were acting so weird. And so what do you think they said?
We're bewitched.
They'd been bewitched. And that was sort of a nice, easy catch-all. Mm-hmm. The girls were out of trouble as long as they said they were under an evil hand. That's what was making them be bad. And so other kids in the community realized that they could act all weird too, as long as they said they were bewitched. Mm-hmm. And then the adults realized that as long as they said that they'd been bewitched, or that they were being wronged by witches, they could point the finger at people they didn't like. Mm-hmm. They could get rid of their enemies. They could steal stuff and settle old grudges. Mm-hmm. And it just snowballed and snowballed and snowballed and snowballed. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of in a nutshell, witch trials.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does.
And there's other socioeconomic things involved with it too.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of the girls who were involved in the witch trials, and a lot of the folks in Salem in general, were refugees from what was called King Philip's War.
Mm-hmm.
It was a tremendous bloody conflict between the colonizers and the indigenous people. A lot of it was going up in Maine. And some of the girls who were making the false accusations were survivors of King Philip's War.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd seen their families get killed. They had terrible post-traumatic stress. They'd gone from being high-status people to being very low-status people, like living as servants in other people's houses. And when they had a chance to exercise their demons and get out of their frustrations, they really rolled with it.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that. Also, at least one girl who was bewitched, if we look at the symptoms of her, probably today would diagnose her with epilepsy. So there was a lot going on.
A lot at play.
And one more thing for today especially, it was very, very cold that winter of 1692 when the witch trials started. It was the coldest winter on record up to that point in American recorded history. And these people were freezing to death in their miserable little houses, and they had nothing to do but gossip. They had nothing to do but pick at each other. And that definitely contributed to it too.
And I think I've noticed throughout my studies, at least anthropologically, that anytime there is an outlier or people that exist in society that don't fit into what we think is correct or the right way to live, one would choose to decide that. But whoever's in charge, whoever has the authority, if they decide that you're not living the way they want you to live, those are the people that get condemned for being witches.
Right, the marginalized people are always the first ones that they point the finger at. In fact, there were some people during the witch trials who definitely fit that pattern. They were the first people. They were going after like the beggars and the cantankerous people. When it stopped, what finally stopped the witch trials is when high-powered people started getting accused. There was one person later, towards the end of the trials, who's not named in any of the paperwork, except they say he's like a prominent Boston businessman. And he was accused by some of the girls, and then he threatened to sue them, or whatever the Puritan 1692 version of suing them was. And if he had won the case against them, they would have been in so much trouble. And he had the money and the power and the prominence. And the girls withdrew their witch case against him. And that was sort of a crack in the foundation of the witch trials. But the final straw is when the governor's wife got accused.
Oh my gosh.
Like Governor Phipps was taking a very hands-off approach to the witch trials. He didn't want to tell the home in England that there was a witch thing in Salem that would be embarrassing and maybe he'd lose his position.
Right.
And he didn't want to get his hands dirty and deal with it. But then they were like, "Your wife's a witch," and that was the end of that.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, it's, something I always like to tell people about the witch trials is we look at it now and, I'm laughing about it because it's ridiculous.
Right.
But the people back then aren't any different than what we are today. Like, we have better technology, we know more stuff, but human nature hasn't changed at all. Like, our brains are the same brains that the Puritans had.
Right.
So this kind of thing could absolutely happen again. And some people might say it's happening now a little bit. So, like, one of the things I really like about the tour is, obviously, I like to talk about paranormal investigation and the ghost stories, and that's a lot of fun, and I really like that, I'm passionate about it. But it's so important to tell the story of the witch trials as well. Like, a lot of the ghosts I talk about have their roots in the witch trials, and they're supposed to be the spirits of the people from the witch trials. But if we don't have the foundation of the witch trials, we're never going to learn from it.
Right.
I think it's just important that we absorb the history and the story, and we can look at it and say, "Oh, that's weird. Oh, that's funny. Oh, it could never happen now." But we're the exact same people.
It's a very good point. And history seems to always repeat itself, even if we don't want it to.
Like, it's very cyclical. And it's kind of funny how the character of Salem has always been contentious. Salem's a very very weird place. You've been walking around for a while. Did you feel the energy in Salem?
It is very weird.
Like even people who don't believe in supernatural things, even people who aren't into energy or anything like that, they come here, and a lot of times at first they get sort of seduced by Salem. They see how pretty it is, and they see how interesting and cool things are, but then they stay and they start to get agitated. Like if you're the kind of person who believes in the magnetic ley lines and all of that, and the healing vortexes out west, we're basically the polar opposite of those vortexes. People who believe in that sort of theory, we're in a negative vortex, like the opposite of a healing vortex. If you stay in Salem long enough, you're going to go nuts. That's what happened to me.
Oh boy. I wanted to ask you too, you brought up some of the vampire stories in Salem, so I would love to hear about that.
So I can't reveal everything, so we've got to keep some secrets.
Yes, of course.
But Salem has a very strong, thriving vampire community. And there's a couple of different types of vampires. There are blood fetishists, and blood fetishists are regular people, just like you or I, except they get turned on by the sight, the smell, or the taste of human blood. And as long as it's consensual, there's nothing weird or bad about that. Like, that's the first most regular, I guess we'll say, kind of vampire. Like, a lot of people, they accidentally kiss somebody too hard, they get a little bit of blood, and they realize they like it. That's sort of maybe the first step into vampirism.
Okay.
We also have people for whom vampirism is a lifestyle. They like the fashion, they form communities around it, they go to the vampire balls and enjoy it, they enjoy the pageantry and the attention of it. They may or may not drink blood. Most of them don't. Most of them just like looking cool and listening to spooky music, and it's sort of like a branch on the goth tree. Yeah. But not the hanging tree, that's a different tree.
Oh no.
But yeah, so there's the blood fetishist folks, there's the lifestyle vampires, and then there's people who sort of bridge the two, who live essentially full-time as a vampire. I don't want to say persona, because it is them. There's whole societies of it, people who live 24 hours a day as a vampire. And those people are cool. Yeah. But then we also get some people who are mentally ill who have a compulsion to drink blood. If you you're a doctor, crack open the DSM, they actually have something called Renfield syndrome. I think it's in the paraphilia section. I may be mistaken.
I would almost certainly guess it is. I have heard of it. That would definitely be where it would fit. Any of the fetishy type stuff. There's just like almost anything you can think of probably has been named. Some Italians like Latin sounding and necrophilia. It has an ilia to it, love. So pretty much anything you could probably think of has ilia attached to it and is made it into the DSM under the paraphilia section.
Look, I think it's kind of fun they named it after Renfield.
That's great. That's some
perfect. Scientists were being clever about it.
I love that.
I like when somebody really just goes out on a limb there, right? Yeah.
But yeah, so we've got the people who just enjoy blood. We've got the people who live in it, and then we've got the crazy people. Those are the ones to watch out for. And you can tell, like Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, that gives the good vampires a bad name. And there's also energy vampires, people who believe they feed off of people's energy. And there's some people in the vampire community who do it consensually. They have energy interplay with one another, and there's whole rituals based around it, and a lot of them would never even think of drinking blood, but they like the lifestyle, they like the art, they like the pageantry of it, and they feed off of the energy, they believe, rather than physical blood. For my money, it's the actual blood drinkers who are cool, but they're all good. Go to the vampire ball. It's a lot of fun. There's a couple of shops here too. Vamp Fangs. A little plug for those guys. They're a really classy, fun, gothic clothing store, and they're run by actual vampires. And they're the folks who put on a lot of the balls.
Amazing.
But yeah, it's so prevalent around here. Every night after the tour, I always wait and let people ask questions. And there was one night, there was this girl who was lingering around and waited till everybody left left the tour, and she asked if I wanted to go get a drink with her. And I said, sure. I was single at the time, and she seemed friendly and pretty and nice. And we went to the Hawthorne, where we're sitting right now.
Oh, nice.
And we were talking, and it became very clear that she didn't want to go on a date. She wanted to jump right to drinking my blood.
Oh.
And I said, no, thank you. I don't want you to drink my blood. And then she asked if I knew of any other donors in the area, blood donors, who'd let her drink their blood. And I had to tell her, yeah, I know a whole bunch of donors, but I'm not going to tell a stranger. You have to find your own donor.
Right.
But she visually didn't look like what you're the stereotype of what a vampire would look like. She wasn't wearing any cool goth clothing. She didn't have dramatic makeup. In our conversation, she wasn't into any of the fetish type stuff. Just super normal looking, vanilla lifestyle. But she'd come to Salem specifically to drink the blood.
Wow.
Which I thought was, I hope she found a donor. I hope she found her donor.
It's a third or fourth date thing for me.
No, get it out of the way.
Early on?
Early. If you're a vampire, you know what? If I really like you, maybe I'll make an exception. Although, that girl was cool. But probably the scariest thing I've ever heard on a tour relates to the vampire stuff. So I talk about the historic vampires, where the legends and folklore come from, Dracula, Countess Bathory, all that. I talk about the modern vampires and the vampire scene and some vampire true crime. And obviously people have questions about it. And this little kid raises his hand. And I'm like, where is this going to go? And he says, I'm a vampire. I drink blood. And this is in front of a crowd of like 30 people. I'm like, oh, really?
What?
Like, whose blood do you drink? And this is where it gets bad. I drink the dog's blood. I'm like, what?
No.
What? And he says, I hit the dog in the nose, and then I drink the blood that comes out. Does that make me a vampire? And I don't know, like, kid's age, but he looked like maybe kindergarten or so. And I was like, I had to tell him, no, it has to be human blood if you're a vampire. Don't drink the dog blood. That's just cruel. And his parents were sitting there like their faces had drained out of color. And they immediately dragged this poor kid away.
Oh my gosh, that's
that
crazy.
Was a future serial killer I met.
Yes.
But like a public service announcement, it has to be human blood if you're going to be a vampire. And it has to be intentional.
Yes.
Like if you get into an accident and you get somebody else's blood in your mouth, or if you get into like a fight, or if you kiss somebody too hard, or if you get a nosebleed and your own blood drips into your mouth, you're not a vampire. It has to be intentionally taken from another person. It cannot be your own, and it has to be drank with intent.
Oh my goodness.
Because everybody gets a cut and licks their finger. That doesn't make you a vampire.
Right.
Don't worry about that. And in my experience, none of them are going to have the supernatural powers. They're not going to fly or actually turn into bats or anything like
Or
that.
sparkle in the sun.
You know, I used to kind of trash the sparkly vampires, but think about this. They were sparkling in the Lost Boys. So we cannot shit on the Twilight vampires unless we want to throw out the Lost Boys. And everybody knows that's a classic.
As a radiologist, I spend a lot of time in the dark, so I sympathize entirely with the Twilight vampire. Most of my work time is in a dark closet.
I don't know. I could see the two of you doing the vampire thing pretty nicely. I think you're both good as vampires.
I have to consider. I mean, we did spend the night in Bran Castle. I also went to Elizabeth Bathory's castle, Kačiske. It's in Slovakia.
Yeah.
That's a good one too. And it's mostly scattered ruins, but it's beautiful. And that's where they she was there for a lot of her time, and then after she got convicted, she never actually got, put to death.
No, didn't they just put her under house arrest?
They put her under house arrest.
All the people she killed?
Yes, they put her under house arrest in Kachiske, so that's where I was, and it's a very beautiful, kind of scattered ruins, and they have an Iron Maiden there, and I did step into the Iron Maiden.
Okay, so
against my better judgment.
What's your take on the Iron Maidens? Because I've heard recent scholarship says they were never actually used. Like they were a creation for wax museums and Coney Island type stuff. Like nobody's ever been able to find a real Iron Maiden with proper provenance.
I've seen enough of them scattered about the world to at least feel like there's some kind of credibility to it, because it's been in different cultures and different places. The one in Kachiske looked very old, and it wasn't just like nice, shiny, modern. It was like rusted, disgusting, long, spiky. Like I would have believed that it was from, several centuries ago, if not more.
How did you feel when you were in it?
Not great. I got stuck to it. My sweater got stuck.
Oh no!
It wasn't a good idea to go in, but then I was committed. But it was.
Did it draw any blood?
Well, no, I didn't close it. Okay. I would have died if I closed it. But it was open, and I stepped in, and just was kind of in it for a second, and then feared my way out. Got in for the picture, but it was. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to have any conclusive thing to say on it. But I mean, I've seen it across enough cultures where I feel like there has to be some kind of.
It's got to be based on something.
Yes, and they had it in Bran. They had one in Bran Castle too, with all the medieval torture devices.
All right. Yeah.
It's not how you would think it would be. It was strange. Like it has this weird, sculpturized head on top of it, and it's like this strange. It's not what I would expect it to look like.
We all imagine them looking like the one in the Addams Family playroom.
Right, and it doesn't look like that. It's very interesting looking, to say the least.
I think you'd like the Torture Museum while you're in town. You
yes,
got to check that out too.
Speaking of that, I guess what are some things you would suggest people must see and do when they're in Salem, aside from doing Spellbound Tours and coming to see you?
Well, obviously Spellbound Tours is the number one thing to do.
Yes.
But if you can do other stuff, if you're into the real serious history, the Witch House is the most important place to go. It's the only building in Salem from the witch trials that's still standing. There's older buildings in Salem, but the witch house is the only one that has direct ties to the witch trials. That's where one of the judges lived. There's folklore that he would interrogate people in that house. There's no proof that actually happened. However, the witch house is haunted. Particularly the room they have set up as the children's room, because Judge Corwin had a ton of children who died before reaching adulthood, and that room, that's the children's room, has a lot of ghostly energy in it. However, when you do visit the witch house, be respectful of the folks who work there. A lot of them don't like talking about the ghosts, but do visit the witch house. It's seeing that and going in there is probably the best way to really feel what the people were feeling at the time, seeing what their world would have looked like. I love the witch house. That's very important. That's the real history thing to do. After the witch house, go to the Nightmare Gallery, which is a horror movie monster wax museum. They've got everything from characters from the dawn of horror cinema up through stuff that's in the movies today. You can go in there, you'll see like Chucky and the Bride of Chucky, but then you can also go back and there's Nosferatu. But the 19 or whatever, 1920s Nosferatu. But they get more obscure too. They've got Vincent Price's Dr. Phibes, who is one of my favorites. If it wasn't so cold, I'd show you the huge Dr. Phibes tattoo I have.
Amazing.
They have just hidden one of the Tombs of the Blind Dead zombies, and the artistry on them. Some of the people who made the figures were working in movies. They were real special effects artists. So if you're a horror person, the Nightmare Gallery is great.
I saw they had a Christopher Lee Dracula there too. We all know Christopher Lee is the best.
Over Bela Lugosi?
I have to say, I don't think they've ever made an accurately good Dracula yet, because I'm all about the book.
Yep.
Nothing quite depicts it well. I was so on Bela Lugosi. If I'm going with the really cheesy,
you just put
lame,
a stake through my heart.
if I'm going with like lame, ridiculous, over the top, what is happening, it's always Christopher Lee.
So I did like when it got kind of silly, like the Satanic Rites of Dracula
Yes.
in the 70s.
Yes.
But you got to check out the thing he did. Have you seen his In Search of Dracula?
No.
It's a serious documentary
Oh.
where Christopher Lee narrates the real story about Vlad the Impaler. Like, they go to the locations. It's presented very dry, but he's got his great voice, and they're going through the Carpathian Mountains and all that stuff.
We have to watch this.
Put it on your Amazon list.
Oh my gosh, definitely.
Just type in Search of Dracula with Christopher Lee.
I respected him because when he was playing Dracula, he was like annoyed it kept getting cheesier and cheesier, but he kept agreeing to do it if he was allowed to say one line from the book every movie. So he like advocated, I will say one Dracula line from the book in every movie.
And I'm sure they let him.
And they did. Sorry, please continue.
Oh, I don't know. I'm just stuck on, give Lugosi a reassessment.
I like Lugosi, but when you watch it now, just the weird like hands, it just doesn't
that's why I
resonate
love it,
anymore.
because it feels so of another world. It's not a world that ever existed. It's like a heightened world.
That's true.
It's sort of like a world that you want to live in, but really don't want to live in.
I can see
like
that.
in the black and white part of history where creepy things are right around the corner, but they're so overblown that it's weird. It's like theater.
Yeah, that's true. I respect that.
Which is why Lugosi is always going to be my favorite Dracula. But, Christopher Lee's good too. I like him.
You gotta watch this In Search of Dracula.
What about Gary Oldman?
I thought that I liked it.
Okay.
I like Bram Stoker's Dracula. I think it's the closest adaptation we've ever had to telling the actual book story of Dracula, but it still missed the mark. It wasn't quite there. And he's heard my rant a million. I mean, my problem with a lot of any adaptation of Dracula is Lucy is supposed to represent innocence.
Right.
She's supposed to be innocent, and she has 3 suitors out of like them just loving her and her innocence and her purity. And every adaptation I've seen, when they include Lucy, is like, well, 3 men love her, she must put out. And she kind of becomes sexualized aggressively, and is kind of a whore for all like every they kind of portray it that way.
Passed between the Texan guy and the other guy.
Yes.
And the other guy.
And it does her dirty, in my opinion. It takes the idea of corrupting innocence when they have her painted as,
I can see that.
yes, like promiscuous, I guess is the right word. So I don't like that part.
You don't like sex positive Lucy?
It's just not. It's not true to the it's not true to the adaptation. I need it to be true to the I like my true to the source, and to me, it's too divvied from the source. And when I read Dracula, the book, I was in tears at one point, which is crazy because I'm like, why am I crying over this story? But when she's dying and these 3 people are coming together to try to stop what's happening out of a love, like a common love for someone that none of them can have, and it's just so beautiful. And seeing this character that's so pure and naive, and seeing that become something like a monster, it's very jarring, and it's painted in such a beautiful way that you lose it when you don't keep that adaptation.
Well, thank you for ruining Dracula.
I'm sorry.
But I can totally see where you're coming from. I'm gonna watch it differently now. And I agree that they shouldn't have cut those guys from so many of the adaptations.
Yeah.
Like
Quincy Morris kills Dracula. How can you not have him? He's the one that does it.
we want to see Van Helsing do it because he represents the modern world, science conquering.
Yeah.
But he's also of the old world where he believes in vampires. Like Van Helsing is sort of the bridge between science and superstition.
And he has there's 2 lines in Dracula that are like in the book that I just love, and I have to always bring it up because it's a piece of its time, right? And you're like, well, this is a piece of its time, and I respect that, but I can't believe this is in this
Typewriters
book
are
right
brand
now.
new.
Yes. And one of them was when Quincy Morris kills Dracula and then he dies. At the end, Mina kind of honors him, saying, if any men of America are like Quincy Morris, it will be a great country one day. That's one of them. And
I don't think that got lived up to.
No. And
Drop the ball.
the other one is Van Helsing describing Mina as being intelligent and compassionate. And the way that this is described is she has a man's brain and a woman's heart.
Interesting.
Which obviously doesn't survive the the test of time.
Right.
But I mean, I'm not going to be offended by something that was written in the 1800s, is what it is.
It's a high compliment at the time.
It is, exactly.
An analytical, smart mind, not tainted and distracted kind of thing.
Exactly.
I think that's what they were getting at.
Definitely. So it's always fun for me to point out the like oh, this is in there and this is in there. This is a fun read.
I kind of feel like the whole portrayal of her being much more technologically proficient, much more on the cutting edge. I feel like the women in Dracula are treated pretty well not treated well because they're being bitten and beaten and all that, but you know what I mean.
Mina Harker was definitely like a feminist in her time. She was definitely intelligent and she acted.
I could see T-shirts with that. Mina was a feminist.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
But with like a couple of little blood droplets on the neck area.
Yes. Definitely. I guess we digressed there too. We were talking about the Nightmare Gallery.
I can talk about those movies forever. Like actually, something really cool. So there's a new thing in Salem right now. It's called the Salem Horror Arts Collective.
Okay.
And it's very cool. They're putting on the Salem Horror Fest, where they show obviously horror movies. They have a lot of new directors being represented, and a lot of the films there's political reasons behind them. So it's a very forward-thinking, inclusive horror movie festival. And they put on fun events. Like last weekend, they had the VHS swap. It had some name. I was calling it something silly like the VHS bullshit bonanza dumpster something discount movie graveyard. But it had a more classy name. But it was a lot of fun, and one of the things they did was they showed movies that were related to Salem. And one of them was something that I had discovered that in a whole room full of experts, nobody had ever even heard of, called Burned at the Stake.
Oh.
If you're a horror movie fan, you've got to look up Burned at the Stake. Nobody was ever burned at the stake in Salem at all. Not a single person was burned at the stake. But that movie was filmed here in the early 1980s, and it's the story about a very inaccurate retelling of the witch trials. And somehow a girl making false accusations gets reincarnated into a girl in Salem today, and some angry Puritan comes through time to kill her, and Reverend Paris has boils on his face like Mr. Boogedy. And what's cool about it is it was filmed all around Salem.
Okay.
It was filmed in the places where we walked tonight, and probably a good 15 minutes was filmed in the Witch Museum right across the street.
Oh, wow.
And so I was just very happy to be able to exhume this piece of mostly forgotten media and show it in front of an appreciative Salem crowd.
That's very cool.
So yeah, keep an eye on the Salem Horror Arts Collective. They're promoting new filmmakers. They're promoting classic artists. They're bringing horror celebrities to Salem. I think maybe last year, Tony Todd was a guest from it. Before he died, it was very nice to get to meet him. And that's the caliber of folks who they're getting to come to this sort of thing.
Amazing.
But yeah, if you're into horror, the Salem Horror Arts Collective is worth giving a gander at. So let's see, we got the Nightmare Gallery, we've got the Witch House. I also like the Salem Spirit Board Museum.
Oh, yeah.
That's really cool. The person who runs it is a big skeptic. He's not going to tell you there's any ghostly attachments on a single one of the boards. I think there might be. But it's awesome. It's floor-to-ceiling Ouija boards, different spirit boards, and they go into the history of everything, where they came from, what their historical roots were. They have some of them for sale. They have like really, really ancient handwritten boards. There's one that I eventually am going to buy called the Black Magic board that has like voodoo imagery on it, which is really cool. It's inaccurate imagery. It's like from the 40s or 50s, but it's that beautiful antique jungle aesthetic, which is just gorgeous. But now they also have like the cheesy Ouija board for girls that's all pink.
Oh my gosh.
Any Ouija board you can imagine from the dawn of time till now. They even have the gravestone of the guy who invented the modern version of it.
Oh, that's very cool.
I think you're going to like it.
I'm very excited to see that.
And ask them about the Hasco magic tray. It's really fun. It's got some Egyptian stuff on it, but in the corner they have a total ripoff of the evil witch from Snow White.
Oh
like
my gosh.
somehow they did the art and they were mass manufacturing this thing with the Disney ripoff stamped right on the board for years before it got not made anymore.
Wow.
So yeah, I love the Spirit Board Museum too. Also, the Dungeon Museum.
Yeah.
So which dungeon museum, depending on who is taking you around in there, it can be okay or it can be really good.
Okay.
But what I really like about the Dungeon Museum is it's a recreation of the Witch Dungeon. Like tonight, we went to where the dungeon actually was.
Yeah.
The Dungeon Museum is a reproduction of the dungeon, and you can see and feel how people are experiencing it. They have one of those coffin cells that you can squeeze yourself into.
Oh.
And they have a beam of wood salvaged from the actual dungeon.
Wow.
And sometimes they used to tell you to reach out and touch the piece of wood for luck. I don't recommend doing that. Most of the time, if you touch it, it just feels like an old piece of wood. But people who are sensitive or susceptible to ghostly energy, oftentimes when they come in contact with that beam of wood, they say it feels like emotions wash over them from the witch trials. They get filled with sadness. So don't touch the beam of wood if you go there.
Got it.
But yeah, those are the attractions I liked. If you're going shopping, the Magic Parlor is my favorite place. I pointed them out. Jokes and novelties, but they've also got real witchcraft supplies. They're really cool. I like them a lot. Hive and Forge. It's all handcrafted and antique stuff. Basically, imagine if Etsy was run by witches and in person.
Okay.
That's like what Hive and Forge is. They've got a great selection of antique books. I know I like them, and I like them a lot. They're a cool place. And if anybody is into comic books and action figures and like nerd stuff, in quotes, there's a shop called Harrison's, and it's awesome.
Amazing.
People are into that stuff and spend the whole day in Harrison's. I know I've done it before. And for music people, the Record Exchange. It's a really nice old school record store that's been around for 50 years. So those are the shopping places.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. But before we wrap it up, too, I want to put Michael on the spot over here. This is your first time in Salem. It's mine, too. What do you think so far? What has stood out for you, or what's been a highlight?
You kind of mentioned the atmosphere and the vibe of it stands out immediately. We're staying at the Warlock House.
Yes.
So we purposely picked, and to stay in an atmosphere that was, designed to be that way. But when we actually came out, we got in pretty late the other night, so we didn't see it when we first drove in. But kind of just walking around today, it definitely has like the quintessential old New England.
Eldritch horror.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I mean, it's just something out of those movies, like the movies that you kind of grow up and it's like, oh, yeah. There's plenty of Hocus Pocus, an American classic movie, kind of, signs and postage and memorabilia all over, and just the footage of kind of like the young children walking around that community, that New England, it just is exactly that. I mean, I know they filmed some of it here, so it makes sense.
You mentioned the gravestones, too, being authentic. Like in Hocus Pocus, the art director did such a good job making the headstones look authentic to the feel of Salem, because I haven't seen any others that look like that in the places I've been around the world thus far. Very unique to hear.
Yeah, I mean, there has a very different feel than, we're in kind of Virginia, and the graveyards look immediately different.
Even from, like, Connecticut.
Yeah, New England, Salem specifically has some beautiful gravestone art, some iconography that you can only see here, and the specific style of the carving is very unique, and you can really trace a lot of the community's history from the tombstones. Like, if you notice the Mayflower passenger who's buried in the Salem Cemetery, by the end of his life, he was extremely prosperous. But his stone, by comparison, is tiny. And it's just the dates and the name, and that's just the minuscule amount of information. Because they didn't have the time, and they were humbler people.
Right.
But as people started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, they started getting more prideful and they started getting more ornate stones. One of my favorite cemeteries here in Salem, I showed you Howard Street Cemetery. We kind of snuck in there, Giles Corey's possible pressing place. I'm glad you survived that. And then we went up to the Charter Street Cemetery, the second oldest in the country, and both of those are old cemeteries. There's one that's a little more recent that you might want to go to that's absolutely beautiful. It's Green Lawn Cemetery. And Green Lawn started out as a Victorian cemetery, so it's landscaped in such a way that it was designed for people to go and actually enjoy. Because during that time in history, cemeteries were a place where people would go and hang out. People would have picnics. They'd go on dates in the cemetery. And Green Lawn is in that pattern. They have a man-made lake inside. They've got a beautiful chapel in there. It's a very peaceful, calming kind of place. And it's also off the beaten path. So Green Lawn, you don't want to miss that.
Okay.
And also, if you saw the movie Lords of Salem, remember the scene where Sherry Moon Zombie gets assaulted by the priest?
Yes.
That was filmed in Green Lawn Cemetery.
Okay.
So you'll recognize that chapel building. But yeah, Green Lawn's a very peaceful place. That's a kind of cemetery where you might want to, sneak in and light a little candle and do a little ritual kind of thing undercover.
Amazing.
I mean, not that I'm advocating sneaking in and doing that, but it's like a very nice energy, calm, beautiful kind of cemetery. And there's also, I could just name way too many cemeteries. There's the Broad Street Cemetery. And Broad Street is a little bit off the beaten path. That's where Sheriff Corwin and Judge Corwin are buried.
Oh, okay.
And they're buried under a very discreet obelisk. Their name is even spelled differently than the way it's spelled in most places. It's like they don't want people to realize it.
Right.
But yeah, go to Broad Street Cemetery and pay your respects to the Corwins. Like that's one of the things that's cool about Salem is there's so much history everywhere. People have lived here for so long. The Puritans and then the indigenous people before, every inch of Salem is haunted.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today and taking us around.
Oh, thank you. I was super happy to be here. I had a good time talking to you. Thank you for coming to Salem.
Of course.
Come back again.
Of course. Can you tell people where they can find you online?
Yes. If you want to take the ghost tour, the original paranormal tour in Salem, go to spellboundtours.com. Also, there is Spellbound Tours on Instagram. There's also Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore on Instagram and YouTube. That's where we do the fun, creepy history videos. We did one recently, which I was really happy with, about the sea serpent in Gloucester, which is one of the neighboring towns. So yeah, spellboundtours.com is a good place to start.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being here, of course, Michael, as well.
Thank you.
And until next time, everybody, stay weird. For more of our fun videos, make sure you visit maloriesadventures.com, MALORIES adventures.com, and be sure to check out Mallory's Adventures on Instagram, Malorie Mackey on TikTok, and be sure to watch Weird World Adventures on Amazon Prime now.